The federal government controls nearly 70% of the land in Utah and has for a long time. But is this a problem? And if so, what should be done about it?
From that basic civics perspective, that we have a constitution that separates powers, and we want the people who are actually accountable to the electorate to be the ones making the rules.
On this episode, we discuss the state's new lawsuit asking the U.S. Supreme Court to weigh in on important constitutional questions around federal versus state management of land in Utah. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking about federal land, specifically how much land is under control of the federal government in the state of Utah. And to have this conversation, I'm excited to bring into our virtual studio a man named Ethan Blevins. He's the legal fellow for the Pacific Legal Foundation. Ethan, welcome to Defending Ideas.
Thanks so much for having me.
And also joining us in the studio is Bill Duncan. He's our constitutional law and religious freedom fellow here at Sutherland. Bill, thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
Ethan and Bill, I'm excited to discuss this with you because I've been seeing these billboards around. I'm sure our listeners and viewers have been seeing these as well. If you're driving around in Utah, up and down I-15 or anywhere else, these big billboards that say things like "Stand for our land" or "Let Utah manage Utah land." And it takes you to a landing page with a bunch of stats and figures about land in Utah. And I want to start off by asking both of you, and maybe Bill, let's start with you. Just give a refresher to our listeners and viewers. What are these billboards all about? What is this issue that they keep seeing as they drive around?
Yeah. The billboards went up as the state of Utah filed a lawsuit against the United States government over as you pointed out, the massive amount of lands in the state of Utah that are held and managed by the federal government, and of course, as a result, the state can't use. So they're trying to draw attention to the lawsuit and the sort of the underlying concerns related to the federal government holding so much of the state of Utah we'll probably talk about this more, but without designating it for any particular use or anything. Obviously, that doesn't include the federal lands that are used for things like national parks, and those things no one has a concern with that. But there is a large amount of land in the state of Utah, and similar to some other states, some of the other western states also have large proportions of their land controlled by the federal government. And they're trying to draw attention to that. But the lawsuit would address this problem. They make an important constitutional argument, which again we'll talk about later, about whether the federal government really can hold on to that land without doing anything with it. So,
Ethan, what's kind of your overall take, again, to just kind of bring our listeners up to speed? I mean, I imagine there might be people out there thinking, well, why does this matter? If the federal government has some degree of control or jurisdiction over land in Utah, does that harm the state? Does that limit things for residents? I mean, we of course love our national parks and beautiful places we can go to, and I'm sure some folks would say, well, we don't want to jeopardize those. Just help put it into context of why is this issue something that Utahns should care about, the fact of the federal government owning and controlling so much land, so much so that Nevada is the only state that has more land under federal control than Utah. And if you look at the map on the state's website, it's pretty staggering to see how much of it is under federal control. But give us that context of in your view, why you think this issue actually should be top of mind for folks.
Sure. This is really a basic civics issue, right? Our U.S. Constitution creates this federal form of government. We have the states, we have the federal government. The Constitution gives the federal government a certain amount of power. It lists those powers, and then it says any powers that are not listed here, the federal government does not have, and they're given over to the states. So the states decide, for example, how land is used or what constitutes a crime. The problem with this issue with federal control of land is really puts the federal government in place of the state. So guess who controls 63% of Utah? It's not the Utah governor. It's not the Utah legislature. It's the federal government. And that runs counter to the lesson that we all learned as kids, that we have this constitution that ensures that the federal government and the states have separate domains. It's really not just a turf war. It's ultimately about individual liberty, because we want to have the people who represent Utahns, who are accountable to Utahns, the ones who are actually governing the land, not the federal government.
Ethan, one of the things I've heard over the years on this issue is kind of a perspective of, well, if there are folks who say, well, I like how the federal government is managing Utah land, meaning they're keeping a lot of it sort of protected from development or protected for environmental reasons. So I wonder if there's a way to kind of channel this back to, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, that we need to think of it less in terms of, do you like the particular outcome that's happening right now, and re-anchor it to sort of this civic structure that, constitutionally speaking, are we not really managing Utah land in a way that is aligned with the Constitution? And that's maybe the first problem we're trying to address. Is that a good way to think about it?
I think so. You're right. Sometimes we might like the outcomes of how the Bureau of Land Management is managing the land, but we want this to be a democratic political process. That's how we work in the United States. We're a republic. We have a democratic process in place. For a lot of the land in Utah, it's not subject to democratic control. It's a federal agency. The Utah voters have not voted in. These bureaucrats are deciding how the land is used and so forth. And that's a problem, both, again, from that basic civics perspective, that we have a constitution that separates powers, and we want the people who are actually accountable to the electorate to be the ones making the rules.
And Ethan, I should clarify, there are plenty of arguments that land is not being managed well currently by federal government agencies. We may or may not get into some of that right now, but that's part of the argument of, hey, one of the reasons we need to have the state have more control over its own land is, one, the constitutional argument that you've alluded to that we'll get into a little bit with this lawsuit, but then also, two, the practical argument is that policymakers in the state of Utah are better equipped to understand how best to manage land in the state of Utah rather than bureaucrats, almost 2,000 miles away in Washington. And so I just want to point out there are kind of those different perspectives. I want to see if we can dive into the case, because again, this billboard campaign and this new lawsuit that's been brought up, I really want to help our listeners understand the context of this case. And there's some things that are unusual about it. So maybe, Bill, let's start with you, and then Ethan, I'd love your kind of broad perspective. Bill, just give us the rundown of this case. What is being argued? Is it different than past attempts? And if so, in what ways?
Sure. The thing that probably is most interesting to people as they learn a little bit about the case is that unlike typically when you think of a case going to the Supreme Court, it's been heard in a trial court. Often the decision of the trial court is appealed, and then you may even have a level or two more before the U.S. Supreme Court gets it, and they're trying to respond to a prior decision, raising a constitutional or some other legal claim. In this case, the Supreme Court is the first court to hear. The state of Utah has essentially filed at the trial level we usually call a complaint. And it initially filed the lawsuit, laying out the facts, encouraging the court to take these facts on, to look into this some more, and it is a procedure that's allowed for in the U.S. Constitution. Typically, you'll see this happen when there are two different states who have a dispute over, like, say, where a border is in the state, or some other kind of unique state versus state conflict. The Supreme Court is what they call its original jurisdiction, allowed to hear the case in the first place. And that's the way that Utah has presented this, that the U.S. Supreme Court should take this as an original jurisdiction case and do some fact finding and make some decisions about what ought to happen here. And there's a lot of ways that could go, but I think that's one of the things that's really quite interesting about it. Just that you don't see these cases every day. You see them it's pretty uncommon. And I don't know if this, and Ethan may know this, this may be one of the few, if the only one, where a state has filed a lawsuit against the federal government seeking an original jurisdiction. hearing from the court. So,
Ethan, what do we need to know about this case? I mean, I'm thinking of this in terms of helping folks to understand at this stage, it's essentially the state is asking the United States Supreme Court to just be willing to take the case. And so the things that are being argued, and both our organizations, Sutherland Institute and Pacific Legal Foundation, have filed amicus briefs to the Supreme Court on this issue. But isn't it true that at this point it's just, hey, Supreme Court, please just take this case and here's why. And then, of course, there will be the big debate about how to rule on it. But help us understand where it is in the process and any other things in addition to what Bill mentioned that we need to know about this case at this stage.
Sure. Bill is right, of course, that this is a complaint brought to the United States Supreme Court. It doesn't have any history before that. And it's an unusual posture for a case in that way. There's very technical, legally wonky arguments about whether the United States Supreme Court has to take the case or not. And we and other parties have made the case that, look, you don't have a choice. You have to take this case. Your jurisdiction over this is mandatory. So there's that debate going on, as well of course, of the argument that simply that this is a really important issue. The federal government owns just over 50% of the United States landmass west of the Rockies. And that has a huge impact on how those states are run and what happens in those states. It's a very important issue. So that's the other side of it. First of all, arguing in this sort of very technical way that, hey, Supreme Court's, whether you like it or not, you have to accept this case. And then the other argument is, even if you don't feel like you are required to take it, you still should, because it's a really important issue for the people who live in Utah and the other states governed primarily, in some cases, by the federal government.
Ethan, can I pinpoint something real quick? I want to frame the question this way. If I'm the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court and you're sitting in front of me and I say, Ethan, why are you saying that I have to take this case? What's the message to the Supreme Court? I mean, help articulate that case that, well, you have mandatory jurisdiction, or here's why you really should take the case. What's the best argument to them to say, you got to take this?
Sure. So there's a text-based argument. So the Constitution lays out what the United States Supreme Court's jurisdiction is, including what Bill referenced, what we call original jurisdiction. In other words, the case starts with the Supreme Court. That's the first stop. It's limited to a number of situations, but what that section of the Constitution says is that the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction in these cases, and I'll list out the various things. And so that shall word is the key argument, right? It doesn't say that they can have, or they may exercise jurisdiction. It says shall, that they have to exercise jurisdiction. When you bring a complaint to federal court and you invoke their jurisdiction and say, my rights have been violated, it would be improper for the federal court to simply say, I don't like this case, I don't want to take it. They have to. That's the role of the courts, and it would cause serious problems if a federal judge or a state judge could just say, I don't like this case, I don't want to take it. So that's essentially the argument going on right now at the United States Supreme Court. It's pretty technical, but that's the basis, right? They shall do it. And then there's, various arguments about, historically territorial disputes about what a state's territory is and what it has jurisdiction over. The Supreme Court has long exercised original jurisdiction in those cases. So there's that sort of historical argument and the more legally technical one.
Bill, I want to pose the same question to you, see if you would add anything to what Ethan just said. You're talking to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, or staff, or or other justices, and the court essentially is asking you, Bill, why should we take this case? What's the most compelling message to them to say you have to or you should take this case?
Well, I that's kind of easy because Ethan's answered it so well. I mean, I think he's described exactly what's at stake here, and sometimes we treat the language of the Constitution like a technicality, but it's really the point of having a written Constitution is that it gives us a way to know exactly what the courts, what the legislature, what citizens are allowed and not allowed to do, and so the court needs to take the case and resolve it for those reasons. Now, I don't know if you want me to talk a little bit about Sutherland, kind of some of the policy arguments that we brought up in the case as well, but the because even putting aside the what I think is again, as Ethan described so well, the pretty compelling argument why the why the Supreme Court should take the case or must take the case. There's lots of good reasons for the court to deal with this now because we're raising. I love the way that Ethan described it. That enormous swath. If you think about it, so the Constitution says that Congress has the power to the federal Congress has the power to dispose of federal lands, and when you think of that, it sounds like it means that you have these lands and you can do something with them, right? That seems to make sense. And that was the practice of of the federal government in early days. And so if you think about like the Northwest Territories and Ohio and all of those places are being acquired by the United States, they almost invariably would then sell them to people to be used and developed. I mean, some were kept for some clear federal purposes like a fort or something that we really needed. And you can essentially see that happen if you look at a map. You just follow along that almost all of those states, there's very little undisposed of federal land. And then you get to the West and you see a drastic change, as Ethan described. And what we wanted to just point out to the court is that there are a couple of some of the principles that underlie our interest in federalism, dividing the different kinds of government powers among different branches of government, not only different branches but different levels of government, that serves some really critical purposes. And Ethan's described again really well some of those, like the ability of those who are closest to the people who are affected by the decisions to actually make the decisions, that's done by elected officials and not by judicial, or I'm sorry, by executive prerogative or those kinds of things. And all of those interests are at risk when the federal government, again, unelected bureaucrats in the federal government, are able to make a decision about what happens with land here and there. But as we look into that, and as we kind of tried to describe to the court what was happening, we wanted also to point out that the states have a long record of doing a great job with managing federal lands. In other states, they have trusts that they have land that's sort of set aside, can be used by the state and its citizens for a range of from recreation to mineral use to conservation. All kinds of different things are being done by the states. Often that then provides specific financial benefits to the states because the states use that trust land to fund their education system, to fund other priorities in the state. And that doesn't happen with the land that's controlled by the federal government in Utah and similar states. It just sort of sits there. And so in a very real way, this has an impact on Utahns because land that might otherwise be available either for their use or for other productive uses that would then somehow, could benefit the state through revenue, through other ways. We're just deprived of that ability, and the whole country loses in that scenario as well because we lose the example of what states like Utah could do with their land that could be better than what the federal government's doing. We argue often is, or different from what other states are doing. Maybe Utah has a better way of conserving, some of these resources or protecting the environment, but we won't know that if Utah's not given the chance to manage its own land.
Ethan, do you agree with Bill that part of this, the practical impact downstream of this would be if states like Utah have more authority over their own land, we're actually going to see a lot of practical benefits for Utahns, for residents of these states, because states, as Bill is arguing, can actually manage these things a lot better than the federal government. Is that an argument that you think carries weight right now?
Yes, and I think there's some really clear examples out there right now. We don't have to hypothesize about it. One example is wildfire, which of course is a huge issue for the West. Every year, the West is lit ablaze again. And a lot of people have rightly pointed some of the blame at federal management of forests. So there's been a lot of complaints that the federal agencies that manage national forest land don't take actions to prevent wildfire risks. So, for example, thinning the forest, allowing harvesting, allowing controlled burning, taking care of weed control. Well, guess who does a really good job of all of those things? The states on lands that the state owns. And there's some good analysis out there comparing wildfire risk on federal land and wildfire risk on state land. And there is a significantly lower risk of wildfire overall on the state lands. And this goes back to the accountability point, right? The people who live in these states and are answerable to their constituents, and their kids go to school with their kids. These are the people who actually care enough to make sure the lands are being managed well. Of course, in the case of wildfire, if a wildfire starts on national forest land, it does not care about the boundary between state and federal land. And so it has this huge spillover effect. And obviously, many people have been devastated by the negligence of these federal land agencies in managing that. So that's just one of many very practical ways in which allowing these lands held by the people who are closer to the people who live in these states and are actually accountable to the electorate will do a better job.
We need to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to ask you about the federal government response, because they've issued a response to this case, and then also get into some of the sort of post-election viewpoints that with the results of the election, a new presidential administration coming in, a new Congress coming in. I want to get thoughts from both of you on, does that change anything on this issue? Could there be presidential or legislative avenues to maybe move this issue forward in a productive way? So we'll get into some of that right after this break. Again, we've been talking with Sutherland's Bill Duncan and Ethan Blevins of the Pacific Legal Foundation about federal land in Utah and the lawsuit being put before the U.S. Supreme Court. This is Defending Ideas. Stick around. We'll be right back after this.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn. We're going to continue the conversation about federal land and land in Utah and which governmental entity should have control over large swaths of land in Utah that are currently controlled by the federal government. Before we jump back into the conversation, though, I want to remind you, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit defendingideas.org. You can access this episode and previous conversations with a number of policy experts from Utah and across the nation about many important issues like the one we're talking about today. Also want to encourage you to subscribe to this show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you like to listen to your podcasts. Just search for Defending Ideas and click that subscribe button. And if you like watching on YouTube, please subscribe to the Sutherland Institute YouTube channel so you get notified each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning. Click the little bell icon in the corner if you're watching on YouTube so you get those notifications. Again, subscribe and find all of this and more at defendingideas.org. So Ethan and Bill, we want to continue, and the next thing I want to ask, you guys have been doing a good job kind of laying out the arguments that the state of Utah is making, that other organizations that are sort of joining in this effort are making. But what does the federal government have to say about all this? Ethan, I want to ask you, so the federal government recently gave their response to a lot of these amicus briefs that have been, I guess, put forward as far as trying to move this case forward. What's the federal government saying? What's their argument on all of this?
They make a few points. One is that history is kind of in their corner, and they really make a big point of emphasizing that, which is to say they've owned this land for a long time, and that is sort of a sign, they say, that this is okay, it's an okay practice, it's traditional, and the court should look to that tradition and saying this is perfectly appropriate. That before Utah and many other Western states became states, they were federal territories. They came in with that sort of overlay already in place. And the federal government says, look, there was nothing wrong with that at the time. And so there's nothing wrong with it now. The state of Utah makes this argument under a particular clause of the Constitution called the Property Clause, that the federal government is obligated to dispose of the land. And the United States makes a very thorough argument that actually the Property Clause just gives them the discretion. It says that the federal government has the power to dispose of the land. And their argument is that doesn't mean that we have to dispose of it. It just means that we have the power to do so if we choose to. So that's another big point they make. They also emphasize the fact that, hey, the state does have some concurrent control over public lands. This is a bit of a red herring in my mind, because we don't want state control to be subject to the whims of the federal government. The state power shouldn't be at the mercy of whatever the federal government decides, level of control the federal government decides to exercise. And so, but they nonetheless put great emphasis on the fact that, even on the lands that they own, at least in theory, the state has some concurrent authority over that. That's a few of the major points that they make.
So, Ethan, is it fair to say then that the federal government is basically saying, hang on, the Constitution and the law says that we can dispose of these lands, but we don't have to? Essentially saying that even if we're hanging on to these lands and not really doing anything with it, we still have the legal right to sort of keep them. Whether we use them for any specific purpose is irrelevant. We as the federal government just have the authority to hang on to that land and sort of dispose it, give it back to the states if we want to, but we're not required to. Is that an accurate summation of what they're saying?
Yes.
And states are basically saying, well, no, again, in the Constitution and the law, help me make sure I understand this right, that if the land is not being used for a designated purpose, that is the land that shall be disposed back to the states. Is that the state argument, basically?
It is. I think their argument is, look, the federal government's narrowly focused on this language that says that they have the power to dispose of the land. But they're forgetting the broader principle, which I mentioned earlier, which is federal government has specific enumerated powers that are listed in the United States Constitution. And the 10th Amendment to the Constitution says any powers that are not given to the federal government belong to the states. So the federal government is not supposed to be in charge of things like land use, because guess what? That is not listed in the Constitution. So we have to look at that language in the Property Clause that gives the government authority to hold property and to dispose of property in the context of this broader basic civics lesson, again, that the federal government is an entity with enumerated specific powers, and all the other power belongs to the states.
Bill, based on Ethan's summation of kind of what the federal government's position is, I'm assuming you would say that, well, they're wrong on this, and hopefully that the case would move in that direction. What's the short version of why is the federal government counter-argument to this not compelling either constitutionally or legally in your view?
Yeah, there has been a theory throughout the history of the history of the way that we've looked at the Constitution. There has been this thought in the past that if we follow a certain practice for a long period of time, then that somehow becomes constitutional. But of course, that doesn't really make sense, as Ethan described, of a written Constitution. Because if the Constitution says a certain thing, if Congress or the executive or whoever, the courts, go a different direction, the Constitution hasn't changed in the meantime. We have to have an anchor, and the Constitution is a powerful anchor to rule of law, rule using laws, not using what we can get away with the federal government. And I think that's a lot of the concern, and the response I think that the state will want to make to that is, okay, yeah, that may have been the practice over time, but if it's not enumerated in the Constitution, that can't change the actual constitutional requirement and the court has done a good job, I think. The U.S. Supreme Court has done a good job in many cases in kind of returning to the original understanding of the Constitution and ensuring that that's what controls its decisions, as opposed to just going along with, well, gosh, that's the way we've done it for a long time. It would upset everybody if we made the change. The framers of the Constitution knew that there will be all kinds of temptations to go in different directions. And so I sometimes use this example. We kind of decided to tie ourselves to the mast of the Constitution and say we might feel a call to go this way or that way, but we're not going to do that. We're going to stick with that original public understanding, and that will be enough to resolve these questions, and we don't have to. We don't have to defer to a practice that's at odds with the Constitution just because it's been around a long time.
And isn't that argument kind of at odds with recent history? And I'm thinking specifically of the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade. That I remember hearing the arguments during that court deliberation of, well, this has been since the 1970s, decades of precedent. But then the court now saying, well, if it still wasn't anchored to the Constitution to begin with, the decades of precedent really are kind of irrelevant, right?
Right. I think that's right. And this goes right back to the beginning, but it is interesting. And the practice of the federal government of deciding we're going to hold on to lands without really doing anything with them in state lands for a long time, it also goes back to the 70s. So even though the practice has been around a long time, I think it's not as ancient as maybe the federal government would like us to believe. It's just that no one has really challenged it. Well, that's sort of the point, is that it now is a time for the state to assert its rights, because that's that's its responsibility to vindicate the rights of its citizens.
I want to ask one other question on kind of the court and the legal dynamic, but then I do want to touch on the election outcome and if that changes anything on the policy landscape on this issue. But let's say that if the Supreme Court takes this case, and let's say if for some reason they rule against the federal government and in favor of the states, and if it hinges on, well, the federal government can't just hang on to land without a designated purpose. You got to give that land back to the states. Could the federal government then just hurry and create a designated purpose for all of that land and say, well, the percentage you said, Ethan, was in 60+% of land in Utah. Now all of it's just a wildlife viewing preserve. I don't know. I'm kind of making things up, but could the federal government basically say, well, magically now all of this land that we have has a designated purpose, even if it's kind of flimsy? Would that be enough legally to then prevent them from having to actually hand it over to states, or not?
It's a great question. I think to some extent, yes, but there's a big but, which is that if that were to happen, then I think that there would be grounds to sue the federal government if they did not then go through with whatever designated purpose that they had, and to challenge them and say, look, you designated it for this purpose. You're not using it for that purpose. And therefore you still have to dispose of it, or there might be some other kind of remedy. There have been challenges under sort of the current legal regime we have where people have said, you have sued the Bureau of Land Management and said, you need to use this land for this purpose. And the courts have said, well, it's not designated for a specific purpose. They can use it for whatever they want. And I think the federal government likes that kind of discretion. So it would be a real cost to them. It wouldn't just be magic words to say it's designated for this purpose. For one thing, they'd be legally bound to that, I think. And for another thing, I think they like the discretion of being able to decide who they're going to lease that land to, what they're going to use it for, and wouldn't necessarily want to give up that kind of discretion.
Well, let's talk about then, with the results of the election, we have an incoming President Trump, we have an incoming Republican Congress. Does any of that change this issue? And whether the court case goes one way or the other, is there, what do you guys think the likelihood is of either a presidential action or congressional action on this issue? Again, thinking, is there a policy solution to this that either is alternative to or in parallel with sort of the legal or judicial approach to this issue? Ethan, any insights there? Do you think there's anything that could happen through these other mechanisms, given that the results of the election are what they are?
There are. So current federal law does give the Department of the Interior the power, again, that's the discretion that we were talking about earlier, to dispose of the land if they deem it to be in their national interest. So with a new administration, the Trump administration might be amenable to being persuaded to dispose of some of the lands. So there's a political process that's available there, and there may be some movement there. There's also a possible statutory fix where we amend the federal law about federal lands, which currently, as it stands, again, it just says the Department of Interior can use this land how they please for the most part, and they can dispose of it if they deem it to be in the national interest. Well, guess what? They very rarely decide it's in the national interest. So Congress could create some standards, maybe say, hey, we should presume this land should be given to create like a legal presumption that says this land should be given back to the state unless, and then there's a specific list of things that the federal government has to satisfy, maybe designating it for a specific purpose that is enumerated and recognized as valid or what have you. And that unless they do that, it needs to be disposed of. So there's, I think, some avenues both with the executive branch and Congress as well that could be taken.
Bill, I'm thinking back to a lot of the conversations we've had on this show over the many months on the issue of religious freedom, and some of the conversations we've had just Sutherland Institute more broadly, this idea of sort of the judicial approach is really valuable if there are court cases that you can win to, in that case, advance the cause of religious liberty. But conversations about saying, well, there also should be a legislative strategy. I wonder if there's some kind of parallel with that to this issue based on what Ethan just said, that yes, this legal strategy is sound because there are some really serious constitutional questions about the management of land that the Supreme Court needs to address, and that's kind of what this case is arguing so far. But what's your take on, should we also be simultaneously pursuing these other avenues, again, given what Ethan said, given maybe some of the opportunities that may be there in the new Congress and administration?
Yeah, I think the answer is definitely yes. That while the Supreme Court has a critical role in ensuring the integrity of the Constitution and ensuring that the laws that are made consistent with it, Congress can correct itself. Congress can it doesn't need to give this much authority to the unelected agencies. In fact, I would go further and say they shouldn't allow so much of that, and Congress ought to take more responsibility for directing the agencies when needed. Many times they really aren't needed, and Congress itself ought to just make rules. And I love Ethan's suggestion. I think that would be very appropriate for the Congress to do. There's the concern I have is that the way we currently do things is it seems like the executive branch and to some degree Congress does the things they think they can get away with until they're officially sued, and then they may pull back if the Supreme Court rules or if they finally recognize, oh, we got to do something. That's not the ideal. I mean, the ideal is for every branch of government to act consistent with the Constitution. And that actually means that I think the executive probably has a smaller role in the likely resolution of this, because it really is the kind of thing Congress is supposed to do, and that all that we've been talking about are powers delegated to Congress, not to the president to make. Having said that, the president can pull back on designations of land that maybe are extreme in previous administrations. So certainly you can correct overstep of a previous administration, as has been done before, but really, I think Congress would be the best actor to fix this problem and allow the states just to direct the executive branch to dispose of this land as really required by the Constitution.
Well, in the couple of minutes we have left, I really have just two last questions. Number one, just in terms of process with this lawsuit specifically, what's next? Where does this go from here? What can we expect to see in the coming months? I mean, either one of you chime in with just give us kind of the rundown of what we can expect to see in the near future.
Well, there will be an opportunity to reply to the United States. They just filed their response not that long ago. It's possible that that'll be extended out. And then once Utah has the opportunity to reply, unless the court requests some kind of input from some other parties, it'll be conferenced by the court I imagine sometime in the early part of 2025. But it's always hard to tell when these things are going to be actually put in front of the eyes of the justices. So my best guess is, and Bill, you may know better, that it's likely that they will make a decision on this during the first quarter, probably of 2025. Certainly not before then.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's a helpful explanation. But what happens after that? It's still somewhat indeterminate how long that would what the court decides exactly will do, and this will be an interesting one to watch. I think one risk that we have is that this kind of leaves the public imagination, right? Or not imagination, but attention. We'll lose some attention to this issue as we wait for a resolution from the Supreme Court. But hopefully this kind of moment in time where we've been paying a little more attention to it sticks and starts an important national conversation. Certainly motivates Utahns to pay attention to what's happening and assert again, the way that Ethan described it so helpfully, that this is a matter of representative government. It's a matter of accountability. It's a matter of the constitutional design, and it's worth paying attention to. It's a serious issue.
So last question before we close, and Bill, I'll start with you, and then Ethan, give you the last word. It's the magic wand question, or the elevator question, that the Supreme Court, the president, congressional leadership, imagine whoever you're talking to, what should happen moving forward? What is the best outcome on this issue, judicially, legislatively? Bill, what's your magic wand? Here's what you'd love to see happen on this issue in the next year or two.
Yeah, I have the advantage in answering that question of having heard a great idea from Ethan on this, and that is that for Congress to be more clear about what exactly, under what circumstances it's appropriate for the federal government to hold on to state lands, to really follow the constitutional design of that, and that means that the vast majority of that land would then be available for the states to use and manage as they need to, responsive to the voters who elect the officials in the state. I think that's the right answer. And I thought very helpful that his practical suggestion that that laying out some specific criteria for determining. I mean, we all recognize there are going to be some appropriate uses of state land. That the federal government ought to be able to control some land in the states on military bases or national parks and some of these other circumstances. But I think what will happen if we allow for state management is we'll see a lot of innovation. I think we'll see more accountability, and I think the states will show that they always should have had control of this land, because they can use it well. They can use it in the interest of their citizens, and that will end up also being a help to the national government, because they don't need to hold on to all this land that often is not managed as it should be.
Ethan, you get the last word. What is your dream of what should happen on this issue in the next couple years?
I agree with everything Bill has said, and so we'll try to add something different, which is I want the moonshot where the Supreme Court takes this case and says the federal government has a list of specific enumerated powers if it's not using that land for a power that is specifically enumerated in the United States Constitution, that it can't hold on to it. And this is an issue that is of much greater importance even than the federal lands issue, which is important in itself, because we have a Supreme Court who has, over many decades, blurred the lines between federal and state authority in a lot of different levels. We have a Supreme Court that I think is, the composition of it is different than we've ever had before, and I think is more amenable to restoring state rights. I can't leave a conversation. I'm physiologically incapable of leaving a conversation without either a Lord of the Rings or a Star Wars reference. So I'll do the Lord of the Rings reference because I'm wearing my Lord of the Rings tie, which is, we have this idea that government power should be divided up, right? And this was the Lord of the Rings idea, is that, there were all these rings and they were divided among the elven kings and the dwarf lords and the humans. They were divided up. But the problem was that there was this one ring that consolidated all the power in one place. And that's a bad idea. And what we have is the one ring, right? The federal power that is just kind of taking over everything. And when you get that, you have less accountability, you have less representation, and ultimately less individual liberty.
Well, I welcome pop culture references like that into these conversations, so thank you, Ethan. And thank you both again. Once again, we've been talking with Ethan Blevins, legal fellow for the Pacific Legal Foundation, and Bill Duncan, who is our constitutional law and religious freedom fellow here at Sutherland. Gentlemen, thank you both for being with us on Defending Ideas.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Well, we're going to take one final break before we leave you with a couple of talking points on this issue. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we go, just a couple things that stood out to me from this discussion today. The key principle to use in our conversations about this, I think, really comes back to the Constitution. Or as Ethan said, this really is a civics lesson. If an entity of government, in this case the federal government, is doing something that actually isn't in line with the Constitution, that needs to change. And all other arguments about the issue are secondary to the constitutional principle. This should drive how we think about this issue, even while we still address some of the practical benefits of increased state control and management of lands that Bill and Ethan both articulated. Well, that'll do it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed this discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode on your own social media profiles or with a friend, family member, or coworker that you think might like it. Lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.